He could not straighten his right arm. He could not fully open his right hand. He could not see out of his left eye. He walked with a limp that would have been visible from a distance, and by the last years of his life, he could not hear an approaching footstep, a growl, or a warning shout. In a world where every one of those senses could mean the difference between eating and starving, between safety and a predator's jaws, this man had almost none of them working correctly. And yet he lived into his 40s. In a Neanderthal community, that was old age. His name is lost. Researchers call him Shanidar 1. He was found in a cave in the mountains of northern Iraq, buried among 9 other Neanderthals whose bones tell separate stories of injury, survival, and loss. When scientists first examined his skeleton, they were startled by what his body had endured. A crushing blow to the face had likely blinded one eye. His right arm had been broken so severely, so long ago, that the bone had partly withered away, the limb curled and useless, possibly amputated below the elbow while he was still young. His right leg carried old fractures too, and decades of listening to a Pleistocene world, of hunting large animals with handheld weapons at close range, had left the bones inside his ears thickened and overgrown, the kind of growth that produces profound hearing loss. A man who could not see danger on one side, could not run properly, could not use one arm to defend himself, and could not hear a threat approaching from behind, should not have survived even one hard winter in Ice Age Iraq. He survived many. This is the question at the center of this documentary. Not whether Neanderthals could make tools, or control fire, or walk upright. Those questions were settled decades ago. The real question is harder and far more human. What kind of family, what kind of group, what kind of daily life allows a severely disabled person to grow old surrounded by others who feed him, who make room for him, who do not leave him behind? For most of the 20th century, the answer offered to the public was simple, and it was wrong. Neanderthals were drawn as brutish, isolated, half-formed men, swinging clubs at each other in dim caves, more animal than family. That image came from an early, badly misread skeleton, and from a long habit of assuming the worst about anything unfamiliar. It shaped cartoons, insults, and museum dioramas for generations. It also collapsed under the weight of the evidence that kept arriving from caves across Europe and Western Asia, because the bones tell a different story. At El Cidrón in northern Spain, cave collapse sealed away the remains of 13 Neanderthals who had been alive together, in the same place, at the same time, a genetic snapshot of an actual family group, related closely enough that scientists can trace their maternal lineages today. At a site called Cova Negra, near Valencia, archaeologists found the ear bone of a child who lived with a condition that would have left her deaf, dizzy, and unable to feed herself without help, and she lived to be about 6 years old, an age she could only have reached if other people carried that burden for her, day after day, for years. At a rock shelter called Peyer in southern France, the growth lines inside 2 children's teeth, thinner than a human hair, recorded years of cold winters, hunger, and a mother's milk. A private biological diary written by the body of a child who lived and grew, and eventually whose bones ended up in the ground for us to find. None of this proves Neanderthals loved exactly the way modern families do. That claim would go further than the evidence allows. But it does prove something that the old caricature could never explain. Injury did not mean abandonment. Disability did not mean death. A body that could no longer hunt, that could no longer see clearly, that could no longer hear a warning, was still worth feeding. Somebody decided that. Over and over again, across tens of thousands of years, and across a landscape stretching from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the mountains of Iraq, somebody decided that. A child born with a condition that would take away her balance and her hearing was worth the years of extra work it took to keep her alive. A middle-aged hunter who lost an eye, an arm, and eventually his hearing was worth continuing to feed rather than leaving behind. These were not isolated accidents of kindness. They form a pattern, repeated at site after site, in numbers too consistent to be coincidence. This documentary follows that pattern from the ground up. It follows the man at Shanidar whose body should have failed him decades before it did. It follows the family at El Cedron, preserved together in death as they had lived together in life. It follows a 6-year-old girl at Cova Negra whose inner ear tells us she could never have survived alone. It follows 2 small children at Peyre whose teeth remember a harsh climate and a mother's care written into enamel, one growth line at a time. And it follows the harder, more complicated evidence too, the signs of hardship, of loss, of a species whose family life was not a soft-focus idyll, but a real, difficult, sometimes brutal struggle to keep people alive in an unforgiving world. Before we go further, a fair question deserves an honest answer, so leave it in the comments if you have thought about this yourself. When your own family faced hardship, illness or loss, who stepped in? A parent, a sibling, a neighbour, someone with no obligation at all? Because that question, who stays and why, turns out to be one of the oldest questions our species has ever had to answer, and the Neanderthals were answering it long before we were. What we are about to walk through is not a folk tale about noble cavemen. It is not a modern fantasy projected backward onto old bones. It is a careful reconstruction built from fractured skulls, worn teeth, chemical traces in tooth enamel, DNA extracted from 13 individuals buried together, and decades of patient, often disputed, scientific argument. Some of what the evidence shows will surprise you. Some of it will trouble you. All of it will bring you closer to a simple, overlooked fact. For more than 300,000 years, Neanderthal families were solving the same problem every family has ever had to solve: how to keep the people you depend on alive, even when keeping them alive costs you everything you have. We begin in that cave in the Zagros Mountains, with a man who could not hear the sound of his own family moving around him, but who never stopped being fed by their hands. Chapter 1: A Cave Full of Relatives. In the summer of 1994, cavers exploring a limestone system in the mountains of Asturias, in northern Spain, broke into a chamber that had been sealed off from the surface for tens of thousands of years. They were not looking for Neanderthals. They found them anyway, scattered through a passage called El Cedron, mixed with cave bare bones and pale, waterlogged sediment. What began as an accidental discovery grew, over the following decades, into one of the most detailed pictures of Neanderthal family life ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Archaeologists eventually pulled more than 2,000 bone fragments out of that cave and pieced them into a minimum of 13 individuals. 7 adults, 3 adolescents between roughly 12 and 15 years old, 2 younger children, about 5 and 6, 1 infant, all of them dated to around 49,000 years ago, all of them found together in the same collapsed passage, having died at what appears to be the same time or close to it. 13 people is small enough to be a real, working social group, rather than a random sample. It is roughly the size of a modern extended household if you gathered every grandparent, parent, aunt, uncle and child under one roof. And because the cave sealed shut around them, protecting the remains from scavengers and from the slow scattering that destroys most fossil sites, researchers had something they almost never get: a snapshot of one group of Neanderthals, together, on what looks like a single terrible day. What makes El Cedron extraordinary is not just that the bones survived, it is that the DNA survived too. Ancient DNA is fragile. It breaks down with heat, with water, with time, and the usual outcome after 50,000 years is nothing recoverable at all. But the cold, stable conditions inside El Sidron preserve genetic material well enough that scientists were able to sequence mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed only from mother to child, from 12 of the 13 individuals. That data let researchers do something remarkable: sort 13 anonymous skeletons into family lines. The results showed 3 distinct maternal lineages. 7 of the 13 individuals shared one lineage, meaning they descended from the same female ancestor through their mothers. 4 shared a second lineage. 1 carried a third, on her own. In plain terms, this group was not 13 strangers who happened to shelter in the same cave. It was a set of overlapping families, related through generations of mothers, aunts, and grandmothers, sharing space, sharing food, and, in the end, sharing a grave. Genetic analysis added a second layer to the picture, and it is a layer worth sitting with, because it complicates any easy sentimentality about Neanderthal togetherness. The pattern of relatedness at El Sidron matches what researchers call patrilocality, a social arrangement in which males tend to stay within the group they were born into, while females move to join a different group when they reach adulthood. Comparisons of genetic diversity in the group's mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lines, against diversity in DNA inherited from both parents, suggested that the adult women at El Sidron were, genetically, more varied than the men, consistent with women arriving from outside, while the men had grown up together as brothers, cousins, and sons of the same small community. This tells us something important and slightly uncomfortable. Neanderthal groups were not isolated, sealed-off units. They were connected to a wider web of other Neanderthal families, through the movement of young women leaving their birth group to join another. That means Neanderthals had something like an actual social structure, a set of unwritten rules about who stays, who moves, and how new families form. It also means the young women at El Sidron, whoever they were, had at some point left behind their own mothers and sisters to build a life among strangers who would become, over years, family. Consider what that must have required. A young woman walking into an unfamiliar group of Neanderthals, related to the men there, related to no one else, needed those people to accept her, feed her, and eventually trust her enough to share food, shelter, and the raising of children. That is not the behavior of a species defined only by aggression and instinct. It is the behavior of a species that had already built social mechanisms for welcoming outsiders into a family unit, again and again, generation after generation, because that is how new families were made. There is a harder side to this evidence as well, and honesty requires stating it plainly. A separate study of the El Sidron skeletons found an unusually high number of minor skeletal anomalies, small congenital variations in the bones, including malformations in the topmost neck vertebra found in more than one individual. Researchers interpreted this as a possible sign of inbreeding, consistent with a small, somewhat isolated population where the pool of available partners was limited. Some scientists have suggested that this kind of genetic narrowing, repeated across many small Neanderthal groups over tens of thousands of years, may have quietly weakened the species over time, making them less able to withstand disease, environmental stress, or competition as conditions changed near the time of their extinction. So the picture at El Sidron is not simple. It shows real family structure: mothers, children, related men, women who had left their own birth families to build a life elsewhere. It also shows the biological cost of living in small, somewhat closed communities across a landscape where other Neanderthal groups may have been thinly spread and difficult to reach. Both things were true at once. Family bonds were real, So were the limits of a small, struggling population. One more detail from El Cidrón deserves attention before we move forward, because it will matter later in this documentary. Chemical analysis of the group's teeth, a technique that reads the microscopic wear patterns left behind by different foods, found evidence of a varied diet that included cooked plants, and researchers were also able to identify likely patterns of handedness and even hints of a division of labor between the sexes, based on how different teeth had been used and worn down, apparently as tools, over years of daily activity. This was not a group surviving on meat alone, hunting without structure. This was a group with routines, certain tasks, certain patterns repeated so often they left permanent marks on human teeth. Researchers studying human child rearing across cultures have developed what is generally called the cooperative breeding model. Human infants are born extraordinarily dependent, and a mother acting entirely alone would struggle to gather enough food and give enough attention to keep an infant alive. Human societies solve this by distributing the cost of raising children across more people than the biological mother, an older sibling, a grandmother, an aunt. Comparative studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, including the Hadza of Tanzania, show that children with grandmothers or close kin actively involved in their upbringing survive childhood at meaningfully higher rates than children relying on their mother alone. This framework fits the family structure preserved at El Cidrón closely, and it helps explain how a single Neanderthal mother at Cova Negra could have kept a severely disabled daughter alive for 6 years, very possibly supported by exactly this kind of surrounding network of caregivers. 13 people, 3 maternal lines, women arriving from elsewhere to build new lives, men who had grown up together as kin, children young enough to still need constant care, and a shared, sudden ending, sealed together in stone for 49,000 years until a handful of cavers with headlamps broke through in 1994. This is where the investigation into Neanderthal family life properly begins. Not with a single skeleton, and not with a guess, but with an entire extended family, preserved together, waiting to answer a question nobody thought Neanderthals could answer. What did it actually look like when they cared for each other? To understand what that care demanded of them, we need to leave El Cidrón for a moment and travel to a cave in the Zagros Mountains, where one man's body carried the physical record of exactly how far that care could go. Chapter 2. The Man Who Should Not Have Survived. Ralph Selecki did not expect to find a body when he began excavating Shanidar cave in the mid-1950s. He was interested in the long sequence of human occupation stacked in its sediment layers, evidence of repeated visits to the same shelter across tens of thousands of years. Instead, over several seasons of digging, his team uncovered 9 Neanderthal skeletons, along with a 10th set of leg and foot bones identified decades later by a different researcher going back through old collections. Among the first found, and by far the most studied, was a man catalogued as Shanidar 1, nicknamed Nandi by the excavation crew. His skeleton, once assembled and examined, read like a medical case history compressed into stone. Start with his face. At some point earlier in his life, Shanidar 1 had taken a violent blow to the left side of his head, crushing the bone around his eye socket. The injury was old and fully healed by the time he died, meaning he lived with its consequences for years, possibly decades. Researchers who examined the bone concluded the damage likely left him partially or completely blind in that eye. Losing depth perception, or losing vision entirely on one side, in a landscape shared with cave hyenas, leopards, and other large Pleistocene predators, is not a minor inconvenience. It is a standing vulnerability that never goes away. Then his right arm. The bone was withered, thin and malformed compared to the left, consistent with a severe fracture, or fractures, sustained years before death, healed in a way that left the limb largely unusable. Some researchers have suggested the lower arm may have been amputated, whether through injury, infection, or deliberate intervention, though the evidence does not allow a certain answer. What is certain is that Shanidar 1 lived for a long time, functionally, with one arm. In a way of life built around close-range hunting with hand-held wooden spears, around processing hides, around every physical task a Neanderthal needed both hands to do efficiently, this was a profound and permanent disability. His right leg carried old trauma too, and the bones of his foot showed a healed fracture. Combined with likely paralysis affecting that side of his body, researchers concluded Shanidar 1 probably walked with a pronounced, painful limp for the rest of his life, running from danger, chasing prey, covering long distances over rough mountain terrain. All of it would have been harder, slower, and more painful than for any able-bodied member of his group. And then, in the most recent chapter of research on his remains, came the detail that changed how scientists understood his final years. In 2017, anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus and colleague Sebastian Villot published a new analysis of Shanidar 1's ear canals. They found extensive bony growths inside both ears, a condition that, combined with other damage, would have produced profound hearing loss. This was not a minor issue layered on top of his other injuries. It may have been the most dangerous of all of them. A blind spot can sometimes be managed by turning the head. A weak arm can sometimes be compensated for by favoring the other side, but a hunter-gatherer who cannot hear an approaching predator, cannot hear a warning shout from across camp, cannot hear the snap of a branch in the dark, has lost one of the most basic tools for staying alive in a dangerous world. Trinkhaus argued that this hearing loss, layered on top of blindness in one eye, a non-functional arm and a damaged leg, would have made Shanidar 1 easy prey and left him almost entirely dependent on the people around him for survival. Not partially dependent, not occasionally in need of help. Structurally, permanently dependent, for the final years of his life, on other members of his group choosing, every single day, to keep him fed, keep him safe, and keep him included. He was not young when he died. Researchers estimate his age at somewhere between 35 and 50, with most analyses landing in his 40s. That may not sound old by modern standards, but by Neanderthal standards, worn down by physical labor, poor nutrition in hard seasons, and a landscape full of danger, it represented advanced age, roughly comparable, in relative terms, to a person reaching 80 today. He had outlived most of the threats that killed Neanderthals young. He had done it while carrying injuries that should have ended his life decades earlier. It is worth pausing on how researchers know these injuries did not kill him outright. Bone responds to trauma in a specific, traceable way. A fresh break has sharp, unremodeled edges. A break that begins to heal shows new bone forming around the fracture site, a visible biological record of the body's repair process continuing over weeks and months. Every major injury on Shanidar 1's skeleton shows this kind of healing. His arm did not simply break and then sit unused until death. The bone remodeled around its new, damaged shape, meaning he lived with it, used what remained of that limb, and continued surviving for years afterward. The same is true of his leg, his foot, and the bone around his eye. His body was not found broken. It was found having survived being broken, more than once, over the course of an entire adult life. This raises the central, unavoidable question. How does a person with one eye, one working arm, a damaged leg, and eventually almost no hearing, survive in an Ice Age landscape as a hunter-gatherer for years without dying of starvation, exposure, or predation? The archaeologist Ralph Selecki and later Trinkhaus working with Pat Shipman, reached the same conclusion from opposite directions of the same evidence. Someone had to be feeding him. Someone had to be protecting him. Someone had to be including him in the daily movement and shelter of the group. Even though he could contribute only a fraction of the labor a healthy adult male normally would. This was not a single act of mercy. It was a sustained commitment, repeated daily, across years, by people who gained no obvious biological advantage from keeping him alive, and who paid a real cost in extra food, extra vigilance, and slower group movement in exchange for his continued survival. Not every researcher has agreed on how to interpret this. Some have pointed out, fairly, that Neanderthal groups may have based at rock shelters like Shanidar for extended periods, meaning an injured member did not necessarily need to keep pace with a moving band every single day. He may have had periods of relative safety at a home base, while others foraged and returned. This is a real complication, and it matters. It means Shanidar 1's survival was not necessarily a story of being carried across mountains on someone's back every day of his life. It may have looked more like a family structuring its movements, its hunting trips, and its food sharing around the reality that one of their own could no longer keep up, adjusting the shape of daily life itself to make room for him. There is a further, separate line of evidence that speaks directly to how Neanderthals responded to pain and injury, and it comes not from Shanidar, but from El Sidron, the same cave introduced earlier in this investigation. Researchers led by Karen Hardy analyzed the calcified dental plaque, known as calculus, preserved on the teeth of 5 individuals from the site, using chemical techniques capable of identifying trace organic compounds trapped inside that hardened material for tens of thousands of years. Most of what they found confirmed a varied diet, including a range of cooked starchy plant foods alongside meat, evidence that directly contradicted the old assumption that Neanderthals survived on meat alone. One individual's dental calculus, however, produced something unexpected. The sample, taken from a skeleton catalogued as adult 4, contained chemical compounds called azulines and coumarins, the same classes of compounds found in plants like yarrow and chamomile. Both plants carry a distinctly bitter taste, and separate genetic research on the same population had already confirmed that El Sidron Neanderthals carried the gene associated with sensitivity to bitter flavors, meaning this individual would have tasted that bitterness clearly, not been immune to it. Yarrow, in particular, has a long documented history of use as a wound-cleansing astringent and as a treatment for internal bleeding when ingested, a property recognized across many later human cultures. Neither plant offers meaningful nutritional value. Researchers concluded that adult 4 had most likely been eating them deliberately, for reasons connected to their medicinal properties rather than their taste or food value. Stephen Buckley, a member of the research team, noted plainly that finding evidence of this individual eating bitter plants with so little nutritional worth was genuinely surprising, precisely because the bitterness itself would have made them unpleasant to consume, and that this pointed toward the plants having been chosen specifically for some property other than taste. Separate analysis of the same individual's remains had already identified a painful dental abscess, along with signs of an intestinal parasitic infection, giving a plausible, specific medical reason why this particular Neanderthal might have been self-medicating with a bitter, astringent plant known in later cultures for exactly the kind of pain and inflammation his own body was recorded to be suffering from. This detail adds a meaningful layer to the picture of Neanderthal caregiving explored throughout this documentary. It suggests these communities were not simply feeding and sheltering their injured and unwell, but possessed at least some working knowledge of their local plant environment, specific enough to select a bitter-tasting, low-nutrition plant for its apparent medicinal effect, rather than its usefulness as food. Whether this knowledge was passed down through direct verbal teaching, through observed imitation across generations, or through some combination of both, it points toward the same underlying pattern already established across this investigation. Care for the sick and injured at El Cedron was not incidental. It was informed, deliberate, and embedded deeply enough in daily life that it left a chemical signature inside a single tooth, waiting nearly 50,000 years to be read. That distinction does not weaken the underlying finding, it sharpens it. This was not one dramatic rescue. It was an ordinary, repeated, unglamorous pattern of accommodation, stretched across years, absorbed so completely into the rhythm of daily survival that it left no single dramatic trace, only the quiet, cumulative evidence of a body that kept living long after it had every reason to stop. Shanidar 1 was not unique among his own group either. Other individuals recovered from the same cave, catalogued as Shanidar 3 and Shanidar 5, also showed healed traumatic injuries, part of a broader pattern researchers have noted across the site. Older Neanderthal individuals whose bones tell stories of serious harm survived. This was not one extraordinary man in an otherwise indifferent world. It appears, at Shanidar at least, to have been closer to a norm, a group in which injury did not automatically mean death, because the people around the injured did not automatically let it. One further piece of Shanidar's history deserves honest attention, because it shows the self-correction good archaeology requires. In 1960, Seleki's team uncovered another skeleton nearby, Shanidar 4, surrounded by unusual pollen concentrations that early researchers interpreted as the remains of a flower burial, a bed of blooms laid deliberately over the body, possibly in mourning. The idea became one of the most widely cited pieces of evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior, repeated in textbooks for decades. In 2023, a team led by Chris Hunt returned to the cave and found fresh, present-day pollen in similar patterns near active solitary bee burrows, concluding insects, not grieving Neanderthals, were the more plausible source. Hunt noted the flower burial story persists in textbooks despite mounting reasons to doubt it. This correction does not undo the broader case for intentional burial at Shanidar, which rests on more than pollen. A previously undisturbed skeleton uncovered in 2015, called Shanidar Z, was found in a carefully cut depression with sediment patterns showing rapid covering after death, physical evidence independent of the disputed flower claim. The lesson is not that Neanderthal burial is fictional. It is that good historical work corrects its own cherished stories when evidence demands it, and the underlying picture of deliberate burial survives that correction intact. We do not know his name. We do not know the names of the people who fed him for years after he could no longer hunt for himself. We know only what his bones recorded, that for a long stretch of his adult life, a badly disabled man remained a member of his community, not despite the cost of keeping him, but because someone judged that cost worth paying. That judgment, repeated, ordinary, and almost invisible in the archaeological record, is the true subject of this documentary. To understand where it came from and how far it extended, we need to look beyond one remarkable man and toward the children his community would also have had to protect. Chapter 3. The Child Who Needed 6 Years of Help. In 1989, archaeologists working at Cova Negra, a cave site in the Valencia region of eastern Spain, recovered a small, unremarkable-looking fragment of bone. It sat in storage, one piece among thousands, for more than 3 decades before a research team led by paleoanthropologists, including Mercedes Conde Valverde and Valentin Villaverde, looked at it closely enough to understand what they were holding. It was a temporal bone, part of the skull that houses the inner ear, from a Neanderthal child. Structures inside it, invisible without careful imaging, showed a set of malformations consistent with a genetic condition known today as Down syndrome, or trisomy 21. The team published their findings in 2024, and the discovery made headlines around the world because it represented something researchers had never confirmed before: direct physical evidence of Down syndrome in a Neanderthal. The child was nicknamed Tina. Based on the growth stage of the bone, researchers estimated she lived to be roughly 6 years old. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what that condition would have meant for her body. In a world with no modern medicine, no wheelchairs, no hearing aids, and no formal caregiving institutions, Down syndrome frequently causes hearing loss and severe balance problems, along with other developmental effects. A child with this specific inner ear malformation would very likely have experienced disabling vertigo along with the profound hearing impairment. She would have struggled to stand steadily. She would have struggled to walk without stumbling. She may have needed help simply to sit upright without the room seeming to spin around her. Feeding herself, moving safely, avoiding danger, all of the basic tasks a growing child needs to master to become self-sufficient would have been, for her, difficult or impossible without near constant support. A modern parent facing this diagnosis has hospitals, specialists, therapies, and support networks. A Neanderthal mother 49,000 years ago had none of that. She had her own strength and the willingness of the people around her. Researchers were direct about what the evidence implies. As the study's authors put it, a child with this level of impairment would have required sustained care for at least 6 years, almost certainly extending well beyond what a single mother could provide alone, while also gathering food, moving camp, and caring for other children. The likeliest explanation, they argued, is that other members of the group, an older sibling, a grandmother, an aunt, other women in the community, helped carry the burden of keeping this child alive. This detail matters enormously, and it is worth sitting with directly. This was not a case of one exceptional act of parental devotion. A mother's love for a child, even a severely disabled child, might be expected on its own, rooted in the kind of instinctive parental bond seen across many species. What Tina's case points toward is something larger, a support system extending beyond the mother, a group willing to absorb the ongoing cost of keeping a child alive who could offer nothing in return, for years, with no guarantee she would ever become self-sufficient. Penny Spickins, an archaeologist at the University of York who studies the emotional and social lives of ancient humans, though was not part of the Cova Negra research team, offered a broader observation about why this pattern shows up again and again in the Neanderthal record. She has argued that humans, and likely Neanderthals as a closely related species, evolved a deep instinctive drive to protect and nurture the vulnerable, not purely as a calculated exchange of favors, but as something closer to an emotional response, wired into the species by the demands of raising children who are helpless for years after birth. Speaking about the broader pattern of Neanderthal caregiving evidence, Spikins observed that these discoveries reveal how alike Neanderthals were to us, especially in a shared human instinct to care for those who cannot care for themselves. It would be a mistake, though, to treat this as a simple, warm conclusion with no complications. Some researchers have pushed back on earlier similar cases in the archaeological literature, arguing that surviving with a severe impairment does not automatically prove deliberate, sustained caregiving, pointing out that in some circumstances, a disabled individual might survive through a combination of luck, a less demanding environment, or a shorter period of dependency than assumed. This kind of scholarly disagreement has surrounded Neanderthal caregiving evidence for decades, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Bones cannot record intention, they can only record outcome. But Tina's case is harder to explain away than most. The impairment associated with her specific condition is well understood in modern medicine. It does not produce a mild, easily managed disability. It produces profound disorientation, hearing loss, and balance failure serious enough that survival to age 6, in a mobile hunter-gatherer group navigating rough cave terrain and unpredictable landscapes, is difficult to account for without assuming real, ongoing, effortful support from people beyond her mother. Consider what that support actually would have looked like in practice, in the physical realities of Neanderthal daily life. If the group moved between shelters, someone had to carry her or walk beside her constantly to prevent falls. If food needed gathering, someone had to bring her portion, because she likely could not reliably forage or hunt for herself, even as she grew older. If the group needed to move quickly, fleeing weather, following game, avoiding danger, someone had to slow down for her, every time, for years, without exception. This is not a single dramatic rescue. It is thousands of small, unglamorous, repeated decisions, made day after day by multiple people, none of which individually seem remarkable, but which together add up to something that looks very much like sustained, intentional, collective care. It is worth returning to the wider comparison the researchers themselves drew. They noted that in many modern human societies, and in much of the animal kingdom, caregiving frequently comes with some expectation, conscious or not, of future reciprocity. Investing in a child who will grow up to contribute to the family, or in an ally who might return the favor later. Spikins pointed out that this framework does not fit Tina's case cleanly. A severely disabled child, unlikely ever to hunt, gather efficiently or reproduce, offered her caregivers little realistic prospect of future payback. If her group chose to keep her alive anyway, for 6 years, it suggests something closer to what we would recognize today as unconditional care, love, if we are willing to use that word, for a species other than our own, extended not because it made evolutionary sense, but because the people around her simply would not let her die. We do not know what killed her in the end. 6 years old is young by any standard, and whatever combination of vulnerability, accident or illness eventually took her life, it does not erase what came before. For 6 years, in a landscape that offered no mercy to the weak, somebody kept her alive anyway. Tina's case joins a wider catalogue of Neanderthal disability evidence researchers have assembled over recent decades, and it clarifies that her survival was not a singular fluke, but part of a recognizable pattern. Not every disability case in the record is this clear-cut. Some, like a Neanderthal jaw found at a French site called Béziers, have drawn genuine scholarly disagreement over whether the individual truly needed outside help or could plausibly have managed alone. Tina's case stands apart because the medical consequences of her specific condition are so well understood and so consistently severe that researchers felt confident stating plainly that sustained care was required, rather than hedging the way more ambiguous cases demand. This is not the only evidence of children shaping, and being shaped by, the daily rhythms of Neanderthal family life. Elsewhere in the fossil record, a different kind of evidence survives, not in the structure of a damaged skull, but in the microscopic growth lines of ordinary teeth, recording, almost like a diary, exactly what winter felt like to a Neanderthal child, and exactly how long his mother nursed him before weaning him onto solid food. Chapter 4. What a child's teeth remember. Long before a Neanderthal child's bones were laid in the ground, that child's body was already writing a private record of its own life, one that would remain hidden inside a single tooth for hundreds of thousands of years. Teeth grow the way trees do, in layers, added day by day, recording the conditions the body experienced at the moment each layer formed. Under a microscope, these layers appear as fine growth lines in the enamel and dentine, banded like the rings inside a tree trunk, except finer and far more sensitive to short-term stress. A period of illness, malnutrition, or extreme cold can leave a visible disruption in that pattern, a biological scar, permanently recorded, datable almost to the week, sometimes even suggesting the season in which it occurred. Biological anthropologist Tanya Smith, working with colleagues at Griffith University in Australia, used this method on the teeth of 2 young Neanderthals recovered from Payre, a site in the Rhône Valley of southeastern France, alongside a modern human child who lived in the same location roughly 5,400 years later. Using thin, carefully prepared cross-sections examined under polarized light, Smith traced the daily growth lines recorded in each child's enamel, reading them almost like a calendar of early childhood. What she found was, in her own description, an extraordinarily intimate view into some of the most private moments of these children's lives, the changing relationship between a Neanderthal infant and the mother feeding it. The teeth recorded evidence of repeated seasonal stress. Distinct bands corresponded to periods of significant physiological disruption, consistent with the punishing cold of Ice Age winters in inland Europe. The children's bodies had responded to that cold by temporarily slowing normal growth, a stress response still visible tens of thousands of years later in the structure of a single molar. This was not one hard winter. It was a repeating pattern, year after year, written into the body of a growing child, evidence of a childhood spent enduring seasonal extremes that a modern parent would find almost unimaginable. The teeth also recorded something gentler, the length of time each child was nursed. Chemical signatures within the growth layers allow researchers to identify roughly when a child transitioned from mother's milk to solid food, because nursing leaves a distinct chemical trace that shifts once weaning begins. The Payre children showed patterns suggesting extended nursing, consistent with what researchers already suspected about Neanderthal infant care, that mothers likely breastfed for a substantial portion of early childhood, providing not just nutrition, but also a degree of physiological buffering against the seasonal hardships recorded elsewhere in the same tooth. There is a specific, striking detail in this parallel record worth sitting with. In the same set of growth lines that captured cold stress and nursing duration, Smith's team also identified the earliest confirmed evidence of lead exposure in any member of the broader human family, found in both Neanderthal children examined. The likely sources, researchers noted, were natural. Lead-bearing mineral deposits exist near Payre, and the exposure may have come through contaminated water, food gathered nearby, or smoke inhaled from fires burning in enclosed cave spaces, since lead can occur naturally in some fuel sources and local geology. This was not industrial pollution. It was an ordinary hazard of the local landscape, absorbed by children too young to know it was happening, and recorded permanently in the microscopic structure of their teeth. Paleoanthropologist Leslie Ahlusko, reviewing the study though not part of the research team, called the level of detail almost overwhelming in what it revealed, describing it as offering an unusually clear window into how something as ordinary as a harsh winter, a family's water source, or the length of a nursing relationship could directly shape a child's early development, written into the body in a way that survived for hundreds of thousands of years. What can we responsibly take from this evidence? Several things, each worth stating carefully, because the temptation to overstate a finding like this is real, and the protocol governing this documentary requires resisting that temptation. We can say with strong confidence that Neanderthal mothers nursed their children for an extended period, likely years rather than months, a pattern broadly similar to nursing durations documented in many modern hunter-gatherer societies. We can say that Neanderthal children in this particular region experienced repeated seasonal cold stress severe enough to leave a permanent physiological mark, meaning winters were not a minor inconvenience but a recurring bodily test of survival, for infants especially. We can say that these children were exposed to environmental lead, most likely through no fault of anyone caring for them, simply through the unavoidable geology and water sources of the region where their family lived. We cannot say, with the same confidence, exactly how these children were held, spoken to, or comforted. Chemistry does not record affection. It records outcome, nutrition, stress, growth, exposure, not the emotional texture of the relationship between a mother and her child. That gap in the evidence deserves to be acknowledged rather than filled in with invented warmth. But the outcome itself still tells us something meaningful. A child nursed for years, through repeated winters, surviving despite documented environmental hardship, was a child who was fed, protected from at least some of the worst effects of cold and hunger, and kept alive long enough for these details to become permanently recorded in adult teeth. Survival at that level, across repeated hard seasons, does not happen by accident. It happens because someone kept that child fed through winter after winter, regardless of the cost to themselves. This evidence also complicates a simpler story that sometimes gets told about the difference between Neanderthals and the modern humans who eventually replaced them across Europe. A separate line of research, a 2024 study led by Laura Sophia Limmer and Sirine El Zaatari at the University of Tübingen, compared dental evidence from 74 Neanderthals against evidence from over 100 modern humans living in the same broad region during the Upper Paleolithic period. Their analysis suggested that modern human children may have shown, on average, slightly more consistent markers of early nutritional stability in their enamel, which the researchers proposed could reflect subtle differences in how the two populations organized early childcare, potentially involving earlier or more extensive shared feeding of infants among modern humans, spreading the nutritional burden across more caregivers. This is a genuinely contested area of research, and it deserves to be treated as one. The differences identified are subtle statistical patterns across populations, not proof that Neanderthal children were neglected or that Neanderthal mothers cared less. Diet, climate, local resource availability, and simple population-level variation could all produce similar patterns without implying any difference in the underlying emotional commitment of Neanderthal parents to their children. What the comparison does suggest, cautiously, is that the exact structure of shared childcare, how many people fed an infant, how directly, and how early, may have differed somewhat between the two populations, in ways that later research may eventually clarify further. What remains solid, regardless of how that particular debate develops, is the core finding from Peyre itself. 2 Neanderthal children endured repeated winters, nursed for an extended period, absorbed environmental lead through no fault of their caregivers, and lived long enough, based on skeletal evidence separate from the teeth themselves, to reach their teenage years or young adulthood. Their bodies recorded hardship. Their bodies also recorded survival through that hardship, year after year, which is itself a form of evidence for sustained, effective care. A tooth cannot tell us whether a Neanderthal mother sang to her child, or held him through a cold night, or worried about him the way any parent worries. But it can tell us the child kept growing, kept nursing, kept surviving winter after difficult winter, in a landscape that offered no guarantees. That, too, is a story about family, written in a language none of us expected a fossil to speak. The method Tanya Smith and her colleagues used at Peyre has since been applied to other Neanderthal milk teeth from caves in northeastern Italy, and the pattern holds steady across these additional sites. Extended nursing, recorded seasonal hardship, and survival through that hardship for most of the children whose teeth researchers have been able to study in this detail. Feeding a child through repeated winters, absorbing the constant risk of infant mortality, and keeping a severely disabled girl alive for 6 years all required something more than instinct alone. They required a group large enough and cooperative enough to distribute the burden of care across more than just a single mother. To understand how that kind of cooperation was structured, who did the caregiving, how labor was divided, and what daily life inside a Neanderthal shelter actually looked like, we need to step back from individual skeletons and look at the broader shape of Neanderthal social organization itself. Chapter 5. A group built around its children. For most of the 20th century, Neanderthal childhood was assumed to be short, brutal, and largely undocumented. Archaeologists who excavated Neanderthal sites tended to focus their attention on adult skeletons, treating the bones of infants and young children as a secondary curiosity, sometimes literally boxed away in museum basements without detailed study. The working assumption was straightforward and largely unexamined. Young Neanderthals died young, died often, and died mostly from accidents or predation during hunting activities. They were too immature to survive. Penny Spickins, along with colleagues Gail Hitchens, Andy Needham, and Holly Rutherford at the University of York, decided to actually test that assumption by going back through the archaeological record and looking closely at what the evidence involving children actually showed, rather than what had simply been assumed for decades. What they found, published in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology, directly challenged the old picture. The starting point was burial data. Across the full range of confirmed and probable Neanderthal burial sites, more than a third involved children under the age of 4. That proportion is strikingly different from burial patterns in other periods of prehistory, including those of modern humans living during the same broad era, where young children are typically underrepresented in formal burials relative to their likely share of overall mortality. In plain terms, Neanderthals were burying their youngest children deliberately and carefully at a rate that stands out even against other ancient human populations. The nature of those burials matters as much as their frequency. Spikins and her colleagues found that child burials were, on average, more elaborate than adult burials, and that the remains and associated objects within them tended to be unusually well preserved, a pattern that itself suggests careful, deliberate placement rather than casual disposal. Some of the specific examples are striking on their own terms. One infant was found buried close to a deer jaw, deliberately positioned near the body. Another child's grave was surrounded by goat horns, arranged in a way that appears intentional rather than accidental. These are not the burial patterns of a species indifferent to the deaths of its young. Consider 2 well-documented individual cases that illustrate this pattern in detail. At La Ferracie, a rock shelter in southwestern France, researchers re-examined the remains of a Neanderthal child originally excavated in the 1970s, using modern imaging techniques and a careful rereading of the original excavation notebooks and field diaries. Their conclusion, published in 2021, was that the roughly 2-year-old child had been deliberately placed in a pit dug into the sediment, rather than simply left where death occurred. The evidence for intentional burial included the near-total absence of tooth marks or scattering damage typically caused by scavenging carnivores, along with minimal weathering on the bones, both signs consistent with the body being rapidly covered by soil shortly after death, protecting it from the elements and from predators that would otherwise have disturbed an exposed corpse within days. At Roc de Marsalle, another French site, excavators uncovered the remains of a child approximately 3 years old, dated to around 70,000 years ago, found in a remarkable state of preservation. The child had been placed into a natural depression in the ground, positioned in a specific curled posture, lying on the stomach, one hand near the head, legs bent, and then covered with soil. The deliberate posture, combined with the depression's placement and the good preservation of the skeleton, has led most researchers examining the site to conclude this, too, represents intentional burial rather than accidental death and exposure. At a cave called Desde in northern Spain, researchers found evidence of a different, more elaborate mortuary treatment. The body of a child between roughly 2.5 and 3 years old had been placed on 2 flat stone slabs with an aurochs horn positioned on top of the remains and then burned. Whatever the specific meaning behind this act, and researchers remain cautious about reading too much detailed symbolism into it, the deliberate arrangement of stone, animal remains, and fire around a child's body points toward ritual behavior of some kind, applied specifically to the death of a very young member of the group. None of this proves Neanderthals held religious beliefs comparable to any documented modern faith, and responsible researchers are careful not to claim that. What it does demonstrate is a consistent, repeated pattern. When a young child died, Neanderthal communities across a wide geographic range, over tens of thousands of years, responded with deliberate, careful, sometimes elaborate treatment of the body, behavior that stands in sharp contrast to the old assumption that young Neanderthal deaths were common, unremarkable events treated with indifference. Spikins and her colleagues drew a direct conclusion from this pattern. In their published analysis, they argued that a close attachment to children offers a more plausible explanation for the archaeological evidence than the traditional view of harsh, dangerous, largely undocumented Neanderthal childhoods. They proposed that Neanderthal children occupied a socially significant position within their communities, reflected specifically in how the group responded to a child's death, through symbolic expression, careful burial, and consistent, generous treatment of the youngest members of the group, at exactly the moment when a community's true priorities tend to become visible. The research team went further, examining evidence for how Neanderthal children were cared for while alive, not just how they were treated after death. They found indications that sick or injured Neanderthal children were supported through extended illness or disability, in some documented cases for months, and in others for multiple years, a pattern consistent with the caregiving evidence already discussed at Cova Negra and Shanidar, but extended specifically into the treatment of the very young. There is also evidence, though more circumstantial, that Neanderthal groups supported the learning process of their children directly. Archaeologists examining stone tools recovered from several Neanderthal sites have identified a subset that show signs of being shaped by inexperienced, non-expert hands, smaller, less precisely worked pieces consistent with a child's early attempts at tool-making, likely produced under the supervision or instruction of an adult. This detail matters because it implies something beyond passive tolerance of children's presence. It suggests active teaching, adults deliberately allowing children to practice a skilled, resource-intensive craft, accepting the wasted material and wasted time that comes with letting a child learn by doing, rather than restricting tool-making to already skilled adults. Spikins offered a pointed reflection on why this evidence took so long to be taken seriously by the broader field. She suggested that unconscious bias against Neanderthals, a lingering, largely unexamined assumption of their inferiority relative to modern humans, may have shaped which questions researchers thought were worth asking and which evidence they thought was worth examining closely. It is a fair, if uncomfortable, observation. For most of the history of Neanderthal research, the default assumption ran in one direction, toward brutality, toward simplicity, toward difference framed as deficiency. The evidence, when actually examined closely, has repeatedly pointed the other way. One further discovery, reported only recently and involving no bones at all, adds a uniquely direct, physical glimpse of a Neanderthal family moving together through ordinary daily life. In 2025, researchers led by geologist Carlos Neto de Carvalho published findings from two coastal sites in southern Portugal, Monte Clérigo and Praia do Telheiro, where fossilized dune sand had preserved something exceptionally rare in the archaeological record: actual footprints, left behind by living Neanderthals somewhere between 73 and 83,000 years ago, dated using a technique that measures the last time buried mineral grains were exposed to sunlight. At Monte Clérigo, on a steep 35-degree dune slope, the team documented 26 individual footprints organized into 5 separate trackways. Careful analysis of footprint size, depth, and stride length allowed the researchers to reconstruct who had made them: an adult, most likely male, standing somewhere between 5'7" and 5'8", an older child somewhere between 7 and 9 years old, and, unmistakably, a toddler under 2 years of age, its footprint barely 11 centimeters long, the heel impression faint, and the arch of the foot not yet fully formed. The physical signature of a very young child still learning to find its balance while walking across an unstable, sloped surface of sand. These individuals were not walking at the same relaxed pace. Analysis of stride length and footprint depth allowed researchers to estimate walking speed for different members of the group, finding one adult ascending the dune at a measured pace of roughly 2.5 kilometers per hour, while another set of tracks descended at more than 8 kilometers per hour, a speed consistent with a hurried pace, possibly connected to pursuing prey, since deer tracks were recorded in the same sediment layer, in a dune landscape well suited to stalking animals along its uneven, vegetation-sparse terrain. The researchers drew a direct, carefully worded conclusion from the coexistence of infant, child, and adult tracks moving together across the same slope on what appears to have been the same occasion: that young children were present when adults carried out their ordinary daily activities, rather than being left behind at a separate, protected location while the group's able-bodied adults hunted or traveled. This detail complicates, in a useful way, any tidy assumption that Neanderthal childcare simply meant keeping children safely stationed at a home base, while adults did the dangerous work elsewhere. At Monte Clérigo, at least on this occasion, a toddler barely old enough to walk steadily was out on the dunes with the rest of the group, following along, its own small, unsteady footprints preserved in the sand between and among the larger, more confident tracks of the adult and older child walking beside it. Unlike a skeleton, footprints capture a single, fleeting moment rather than a lifetime of accumulated evidence. This documentary should be careful not to overstate what one trackway, from one afternoon roughly 80,000 years ago, can tell us about the whole of Neanderthal family life. But within that appropriate caution, the Monte Clérigo footprints offer something no bone or tooth ever could: a direct, literal trace of a Neanderthal family, adult, child, and toddler, moving across the same landscape together at the same time, leaving behind the simplest and most universally human evidence there is of a family walking somewhere as one. There is a particular irony worth naming here. In 1908, excavators near La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France uncovered a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton, an older adult male who had lost nearly all of his teeth before death, with advanced bone loss showing the process had unfolded gradually over years. He suffered from severe arthritis affecting his spine, hip, and shoulder. Researchers concluded he was likely in his 60s when he died, genuinely advanced age by Neanderthal standards, and that he had almost certainly required food softened or specially prepared for him by others, since he could no longer chew tough meat. The French paleontologist Marcelin Boule, producing the first scientific reconstruction of this skeleton, built his interpretation on a body already twisted by decades of untreated arthritis, and misread that deformation as the natural posture of the entire species, a stooped, bent-kneed, ape-like figure that shaped public understanding of Neanderthals for the following half-century, feeding directly into the brutish caricature this documentary opened by describing. The very skeleton most responsible for cementing that myth was, in reality, evidence against it. A toothless, arthritic elder kept fed and sheltered for years by a community doing exactly what families do for their oldest and most fragile members in every generation since. None of this means Neanderthal childhood or Neanderthal aging was easy, safe, or free from loss. The evidence discussed in the next chapter makes clear that hardship, injury, and death were constant, unavoidable pressures on Neanderthal families, not softened by good intentions alone. But the picture emerging from burial data, from caregiving evidence, and from the physical traces of children learning alongside adults is not one of indifference. It is a picture of a species that organized real effort, real resources, and real emotional weight around the survival, the death, and the upbringing of its youngest members. A pattern that looks, in its broad outline, remarkably familiar. To understand how that pattern held together under real pressure, we need to look at the other side of the ledger, the hardships Neanderthal families could not always overcome, and what those failures tell us about the true cost of keeping a family alive in the Ice Age. Chapter 6. The Families They Could Not Save. Everything documented so far in this investigation is real. The disabled man who lived for decades, the child with Down syndrome who survived 6 years on collective care, the family group at El Cidrón, tied together across 3 maternal lines, the children whose teeth recorded years of nursing through repeated winters. All of it is supported by direct physical evidence, published in peer-reviewed research, checked and rechecked by scientists who have spent careers studying these bones. But an honest documentary cannot stop there, because it would leave a badly distorted impression. For every Shanidar 1 who survived catastrophic injury into what counted as old age, the fossil record holds many more Neanderthals who did not survive nearly that long, and whose deaths reveal just how narrow the margin for survival actually was, even for families willing to do everything in their power to protect their own. The demographic data is stark and worth stating plainly. Eric Trinkhaus, examining the age at death recorded in 206 Neanderthal skeletons across Europe and the Near East, found that roughly 80% of these individuals died before reaching what would be considered middle age, the rough equivalent of 40 human years. The largest single group, about 40% of the total sample, died specifically during early adulthood, somewhere between the ages of 20 and 40. Genetic-based lifespan estimates, developed more recently using patterns of DNA methylation, put the average Neanderthal life expectancy at somewhere around 38 years, startlingly close to comparable estimates for early modern humans living in the same era, before the arrival of modern medicine and modern sanitation dramatically extended human lifespans within just the past 2 centuries. Infant and early childhood mortality was severe as well. Estimates drawn from the skeletal record suggest that around 28% of Neanderthal infants died within their first year of life, a devastating rate by today's standards, though broadly comparable to infant mortality among human populations before the modern era. This was not a species uniquely failing to protect its young compared to early humans. It was a species existing under the same brutal demographic pressures that defined nearly all of human history before recent centuries. pressures that only began to ease within the lifetime of people's great-grandparents. What killed them? The causes recoverable from skeletal evidence point toward a combination of dangers that no amount of family devotion could fully eliminate. Traumatic injury appears repeatedly across the Neanderthal fossil record, consistent with a way of life built around close-range hunting of large, dangerous animals, using hand-thrown or hand-thrust wooden and stone-tipped weapons. A hunting method that put hunters within reach of an animal's horns, hooves, and teeth, rather than allowing the kind of safe distance a thrown or projectile weapon can provide. In 1995, researchers Thomas Berger and Eric Trinkhaus published an influential analysis examining 27 documented traumatic injuries across 17 Neanderthal skeletons, comparing the distribution of those injuries against archaeological populations and 20th century clinical injury data. What they found was striking. Roughly 30% of the sample showed evidence of injuries to the skull, a proportion notably higher than found in either other prehistoric populations or modern clinical comparisons, combined with a marked pattern of shoulder and arm trauma and a comparatively low rate of injuries to the legs and feet. Searching for a modern population with a comparable injury signature, the researchers found one closer match than any other: North American rodeo athletes, whose work bringing them into repeated, violent, close-range contact with large animals produces a strikingly similar pattern of head, neck, and upper body trauma. Berger and Trinkhaus were careful to clarify they were not suggesting Neanderthals rode broncos, only that the comparison pointed toward frequent, dangerous, close-quarters encounters with large, uncooperative animals, precisely the kind of encounter a close-range spear hunter would face repeatedly across a working lifetime. This comparison became one of the most widely cited findings in Neanderthal research, reinforcing the broader picture of a species whose survival required repeated physical risk. But science self-corrects, and this particular finding has faced serious challenge in the years since. A later reanalysis by researchers Libby Cowgill and James Bain, drawing on a larger and more systematic modern injury database, found meaningful discrepancies with the original 1995 study, including substantially fewer head injuries and considerably more hand injuries among actual rodeo athletes than the original comparison had suggested, and an overall Neanderthal injury rate to the head lower than some later studies of modern human trauma. Trinkhaus himself later revisited the question in a follow-up study, expanding the comparison to include early modern humans who lived alongside Neanderthals during the same period, and found no statistically meaningful difference between the two populations' injury patterns. Both showed considerable head and upper body trauma, undermining the idea that Neanderthals specifically, as opposed to Pleistocene hunter-gatherers generally, faced an unusually dangerous style of life. This scholarly back-and-forth matters for how this documentary presents its evidence, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than smoothed over. The specific rodeo rider comparison, once treated as a settled, vivid illustration of Neanderthal hunting danger, is now understood by many researchers to rest on a flawed statistical foundation. And the honest current position is that Neanderthals very likely faced serious injury risk from their hunting lifestyle, broadly comparable to other Pleistocene hunter-gatherer populations including early modern humans, without necessarily being unique or exceptional in the degree of danger they faced. What remains solid, regardless of how this specific debate settles, is the underlying physical evidence already discussed throughout this documentary. Real skeletons, at real sites, showing real, healed trauma, severe enough that survival required real, sustained help from other members of the group. Harsh seasonal climate, the same cold recorded in the growth lines of the children's teeth at Pear, would have brought its own toll. Hypothermia, frostbite, and the secondary effects of malnutrition during lean winter months when hunting success dropped and stored food ran short. Disease, difficult to trace directly in skeletal remains but almost certainly present, would have added another layer of risk, particularly to infants and young children with less developed immune resistance. And childbirth itself, without modern obstetric intervention, carried very real danger for Neanderthal mothers in ways broadly comparable to the risks of childbirth throughout most of human history before the modern era. There is a particular demographic puzzle in the Neanderthal mortality data that researchers have wrestled with for decades, and it deserves mention here because it complicates the picture of caregiving explored throughout this documentary. Compared to both modern hunter-gatherer populations and to other primate species, the Neanderthal skeletal sample shows relatively few individuals who reached genuinely old age, the equivalent of what we might call the elderly today, even accounting for the difficulties of estimating age from incomplete skeletal remains. Some researchers have suggested this reflects a real biological or environmental limit on Neanderthal longevity. Others have argued it may partly reflect a bias in which sites and skeletons happen to survive and be discovered, or in how confidently researchers can estimate advanced age from incomplete bones. The honest answer is that this remains a genuinely unresolved question in current research, and this documentary is not in a position to settle it. What can be said with confidence is this: survival to anything resembling old age, for a Neanderthal, was the exception rather than the rule. Shanidar 1, at somewhere between 35 and 50 years old when he died, was already unusual simply for having lived that long, entirely apart from the severity of his injuries. His survival stood out to researchers precisely because it was rare, a hard-won outcome in a population where most adults did not make it past their 30s. This matters enormously for how we understand the caregiving evidence discussed throughout this documentary. It is tempting, when presented with cases like Shanidar 1 or the child at Cova Negra, to imagine Neanderthal family life as a kind of quiet, dependable safety net, always ready to catch anyone in need. The mortality data pushes back against that image, hard. Most Neanderthals who fell seriously ill, who suffered severe trauma, or who were born with significant disability, appear to have died from it, often quickly. The cases of sustained survival that this documentary has focused on are not typical outcomes. They are documented exceptions, individuals whose survival required an extraordinary, sustained commitment from the people around them, precisely because the ordinary outcome, in the same circumstances, was usually death. Framed this way, the evidence becomes, if anything, more meaningful rather than less. Shanidar 1 did not survive because Neanderthal groups could effortlessly absorb the cost of a disabled member. He survived because, in a population where death from injury or illness was the statistical norm, a specific group of people chose, repeatedly, to work against those odds for as long as it took. The child at Cova Negra did not survive 6 years because caring for a severely disabled infant was easy or unremarkable within Neanderthal society. She survived because, against a demographic backdrop where nearly a third of infants died in their first year alone, her caregivers kept her alive anyway, for 6 times as long as that first, most dangerous year. The comparison with modern hunter-gatherer societies is instructive here as well. Researchers examining care for illness and injury among contemporary hunter-gatherer populations have observed that both men and women typically contribute to hunting and to childcare, in varying combinations depending on local circumstances, and that even severe physical impairments can sometimes be accommodated through a shift in social role rather than abandonment. An injured hunter might take on tool-making, teaching, or camp-based tasks instead of active pursuit hunting, remaining a contributing member of the group despite reduced physical capacity. This pattern, documented in living human societies, offers a plausible, evidence-consistent model for how a Neanderthal group might have similarly restructured itself around an injured or disabled member, without requiring us to imagine pure, uncompensated charity as the only explanation. That distinction between care as pure sacrifice and care as a restructured, mutually sustaining social arrangement is worth holding on to as this investigation continues. Neither framing erases the other. Some of what kept Shanidar 1 alive was almost certainly people simply choosing to feed a family member who could no longer earn his keep in the traditional sense. Some of it may also have reflected a more practical social calculation, a group finding new roles, new forms of contribution, for a member who could no longer hunt, but who might still teach, might still watch children, might still process hides or nap tools with one working hand and decades of accumulated skill. Both possibilities are consistent with the evidence. Both describe a society sophisticated enough to adapt its own structure around the changing needs of its members, which is, itself, a form of family life far more complex than the old caricature of brutish, disposable Neanderthal lives ever allowed for. Having confronted the hard limits of what Neanderthal families could and could not overcome, we can now turn to a more specific question this documentary has touched on repeatedly without yet examining directly: how labor, food, and daily responsibility were actually divided within a Neanderthal family, and what that division tells us about who did the work of keeping everyone alive. Chapter 7. What teeth reveal about who did the work keeping a family alive through repeated winters, through injury, through the demands of infants and disabled elders, required labor. Somebody had to gather food, process hides, sharpen tools, prepare skins for warmth, and care for children while other adults hunted. For decades, researchers assumed this labor was divided along lines resembling many later human societies, but they had almost no direct evidence to test that assumption against, until a research team led by Almudena Estalric and Antonio Rosas at the Spanish National Research Council found an unexpected source of information hiding in plain sight, in ordinary Neanderthal front teeth. Neanderthals used their mouths constantly as a working tool, not just for eating. Ethnographic studies of modern populations who process hides and fibers by hand have documented similar behavior, gripping material between the front teeth to hold it steady while the hands work, using the mouth essentially as a third limb during repetitive craft tasks. This habit leaves a distinctive signature on the teeth over time, grooves worn into the enamel, tiny chips and nicks accumulated from repeated contact with tough material, all recorded permanently in the structure of the tooth itself. Estalrich and Rosas examined 99 incisors and canine teeth recovered from 19 Neanderthal individuals across 3 separate sites: El Cedron in Spain, Lotus in France, and Spy in Belgium, allowing comparison across different populations and locations rather than relying on a single group. What they found was a consistent, statistically meaningful pattern. The grooves and wear marks on female teeth followed one recognizable pattern, while male teeth showed a distinctly different one. Specifically, male individuals showed a greater number of small enamel chips concentrated toward the upper portions of the affected teeth, while female individuals showed similar damage concentrated toward the lower portions, with striations that tended to run longer than those found on male teeth. The researchers could not determine with certainty which specific tasks produced each pattern, since no single activity leaves a perfectly unique signature. But drawing on comparisons with toolmark studies in other ancient and modern populations, they proposed a plausible interpretation. The male pattern was consistent with retouching and resharpening the cutting edges of stone tools, a task requiring precise, repeated pressure near the top of the front teeth. The female pattern, involving longer, lower striations, was consistent with processing hides and furs, the repetitive scraping, stretching, and softening work required to turn a raw animal skin into usable, wearable material. Rosas placed this finding within the broader arc of how understanding of Neanderthals had shifted by the time of publication. He noted that the field had moved a long way from viewing Neanderthals as primitive, undeveloped beings toward recognizing that they cared for their sick, buried their dead, consumed seafood, and displayed physical diversity including light skin, light eyes, and red hair in at least some populations. Until this specific study, he added, sex-based division of labor had generally been assumed to be a development unique to modern human societies. The Neanderthal evidence suggested otherwise. It is important, though, to state the limits of this finding as clearly as the finding itself. Estalrich was careful to note that this apparent specialization appeared limited to a narrow set of tasks, tool maintenance and hide processing specifically, rather than describing a comprehensive, rigid division of all labor along strict lines. She stated directly that both men and women likely participated equally in hunting large game, a conclusion drawn from separate research examining Neanderthal skeletal robustness and limb development, which shows less dramatic difference between male and female upper body strength than exists in many later human populations, suggesting Neanderthal women may have been physically capable of throwing spears or thrusting handheld weapons with an effectiveness comparable to many modern human men, given the generally greater overall physical robustness of Pleistocene bodies compared to people today. A separate line of dental wear research, examining a broader set of activity-related patterns, adds useful nuance here. That research noted the near-total absence, at Neanderthal sites, of grinding stones and other tools specifically associated in modern hunter-gatherer societies with intensive plant processing. Equipment often linked to a distinct category of female labor in many later human cultures. Researchers interpreted this absence as evidence that Neanderthal women were not confined to a narrowly defined, food-gathering-only role separate from hunting, in the way some later human societies eventually developed. Instead, both sexes appear to have participated directly in acquiring meat through hunting, with the more limited, task-specific division of labor visible in the teeth, applying mainly to what happened after the hunt, processing the kill, preparing the hide, maintaining the tools that made the next hunt possible. This picture, cautious and evidence-bound as it is, tells us something meaningful about the internal structure of Neanderthal family life. Labor was not undivided chaos, with every individual doing identical work regardless of sex or role. Nor was it a rigid system confining women exclusively to camp-based tasks, while men handled all physically demanding or dangerous work. It appears to have been something in between, a flexible arrangement in which certain specific tasks clustered around one sex more than the other, layered on top of a broader pattern in which both men and women likely shared in the highest risk, highest reward activity of the group, hunting large, dangerous animals for meat. Breastfeeding and, by strong implication, most of the direct carrying of infants would have fallen primarily to women, simply as a matter of biology rather than social assignment. A Neanderthal mother nursing a child, as the evidence from Peyer demonstrated, for an extended period across multiple years. This alone would have shaped daily patterns of activity and mobility for women with young children, likely explaining at least part of why hide processing and camp-based craftwork, tasks compatible with having an infant nearby, might have clustered more heavily around women, without excluding them from hunting when circumstances allowed or required it. None of this evidence can tell us how any individual Neanderthal family actually negotiated these roles day to day, whether flexibly or rigidly, whether by unspoken custom or active discussion. Teeth record outcomes accumulated over years of repeated behavior, not the individual choices or conversations that produced those patterns. But taken together with everything else this documentary has examined, the shared caregiving evident at Cova Negra, the extended, sustained support required to keep Shanidar 1 alive, the deliberate, careful burial of young children found across dozens of sites, the picture of Neanderthal family life that emerges is neither the brutish caricature of the old textbooks, nor a soft, idealized fantasy of effortless harmony. It is something closer to what any honest look at human family life across history tends to reveal. Labor divided imperfectly and flexibly between people who depended on each other, care extended at real cost to those who needed it most, and a social structure sophisticated enough to adapt itself, task by task, generation by generation, to the demands of an unforgiving world. This division of labor, and the caregiving it made possible, did not exist in isolation. It depended on Neanderthal groups being able to communicate complex information to each other: who was injured, what needed doing, where danger lay, how to teach a child a difficult new skill. To understand how deeply family life and cooperation were embedded in Neanderthal cognitive and social life, we need to examine what the evidence shows about their capacity for communication, teaching, and shared understanding. Chapter 8. Could they even tell each other what hurt? Everything documented so far in this investigation depends on a single, largely unspoken assumption: that Neanderthals could communicate complex, specific information to one another. Someone needed to be told that a child was struggling to hear or losing her balance. Someone needed to coordinate who would carry the injured man, who would gather extra food for him, who would slow the group's pace to accommodate his limp. None of the sustained caregiving this documentary has described could function purely through instinct and observation. It required, at minimum, some capacity to share knowledge, assign tasks, and pass down understanding across generations. For decades, the ability of Neanderthals to do this at all was one of the most contested questions in the entire field. The evidence centers on a small, delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone called the hyoid, which sits in the throat, unconnected to any other bone in the human body, anchoring the muscles and ligaments essential for speech and swallowing. Because it is small, fragile, and rarely preserved, complete fossil hyoid bones are exceptionally rare finds. In 1983, excavators working at Kebara Cave in Israel uncovered a near-complete Neanderthal skeleton dating to roughly 60,000 years ago, and among the remains was an intact hyoid bone, one of the only such finds from any Neanderthal skeleton ever recovered. When researchers examined it, the resemblance to a modern human hyoid was immediate and striking. Its overall shape, its proportions, and the anchor points for surrounding muscles closely matched what is seen in modern human anatomy, differing meaningfully from what is found in non-human primates like chimpanzees, whose hyoid bones sit differently and cannot support the same range of controlled vocalization. This single bone reopened a debate that had simmered for decades. Some researchers argued that shape alone could not prove function. A bone resembling the modern human hyoid did not necessarily mean it operated the same way, given that other soft tissue structures needed for speech, including the vocal cords themselves, do not survive in the fossil record and can never be directly examined. Others pushed the investigation further, using increasingly sophisticated methods to test whether the Kebara hyoid and a later, smaller fragment recovered from El Sidron, dated to roughly 43,000 years ago, actually functioned the way a modern human hyoid does. A team led by researchers including Stephen Rowe built detailed computer models of the Kebara hyoid using three-dimensional imaging, then tested its mechanical behavior under simulated stress and compared it directly against models of modern human hyoids. The result, in Rowe's own description, was that the Neanderthal hyoid proved mechanically almost indistinguishable from a modern human one, strongly suggesting this key structure of the vocal tract functioned in essentially the same way it does for us today. A separate, more recent study went a step further, analysing not just the external shape of the Kebara and El Sidron hyoids, but their internal bone architecture, the microscopic trabecular structure that forms in direct response to the physical forces a bone regularly experiences during life. That internal architecture, the researchers found, closely matched the patterns seen in modern human hyoids, adding independent physical evidence that these bones were being used functionally the way ours are used today. A separate and equally important line of evidence comes from the ear rather than the throat. Researchers using detailed CT scans and models drawn from the field of auditory bioengineering reconstructed how sound would have traveled through the outer and middle ear structures preserved in Neanderthal skulls. Their findings showed that Neanderthal hearing capacity closely matched modern human hearing, specifically within the frequency range most relevant to speech, roughly 1 to 6 kHz. This detail matters because hearing and speech tend to evolve together. An ear well tuned to the specific frequencies of spoken language is difficult to explain unless that population was, in fact, regularly using spoken language within that frequency range, generation after generation, in a way strong enough to shape how their auditory system itself developed. None of this settles the debate completely, and honesty about ongoing scientific disagreement matters more here than almost anywhere else in this documentary. Some researchers remain cautious about drawing a straight line from vocal tract anatomy to full modern language, pointing out that speech involves not just the physical capacity to produce sound, but also brain structures governing grammar, symbolic thought, and complex sequential reasoning, none of which can be directly measured from a single bone, however well preserved. The honest, responsible summary of where the evidence currently stands is this. Neanderthals very likely possessed the physical anatomy necessary for a wide range of controlled vocal sounds, including many vowels and a range of consonants overlapping substantially with modern human speech, and their hearing was well matched to detect those same sounds. Whether their communication reached the full grammatical complexity of a modern spoken language remains a genuinely open question that current fossil evidence cannot completely resolve on its own. What can be stated with greater confidence is that Neanderthals did not need full grammatical language to accomplish the kind of coordinated caregiving this documentary has documented throughout. A combination of vocal calls, gesture, learned routine, and close physical familiarity, built up over a lifetime shared within a small group of related individuals, could plausibly account for a great deal of the coordination required to keep an injured hunter fed, to recognize when a child was struggling, or to pass down the specific hand movements required to nap a stone tool or scrape a hide correctly. The evidence of children's tools shaped by inexperienced hands, discussed earlier in this documentary, points toward active teaching regardless of exactly how sophisticated the accompanying verbal instruction may have been. A skilled adult guiding a child's hands, correcting mistakes, demonstrating technique, in a process that likely combined whatever verbal communication Neanderthals possessed with direct physical demonstration passed from one generation to the next. There is a broader implication worth drawing out here, connecting this chapter directly back to the caregiving evidence already examined. A group capable of sustaining a severely disabled member for years, of organizing labor along consistent, repeated patterns, of teaching children specific craft skills across generations, and of responding to a child's death with elaborate, deliberate ritual, was almost certainly a group capable of meaningful communication well beyond simple alarm calls or basic gesture. The social complexity documented throughout this investigation, family structures spanning multiple maternal lineages, sustained care for the injured and disabled, structured division of labor, deliberate child burial, all of it implies a level of shared understanding, memory, and coordinated intention that is difficult to explain without some robust form of communication underlying it, whatever its precise grammatical sophistication may have been. A separate category of evidence, unrelated to anatomy but tied to the same question of shared meaning, comes from an unexpected source: eagle talons. At Krapina, a rock shelter in Croatia, excavations recovered 8 white-tailed eagle talons from a minimum of 3 birds in a layer dated to roughly 130,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived anywhere in Europe. Researchers led by Dvorka Radovcic found the talons bore cut marks and polishing facets in locations that made little sense for butchery, but made strong sense as evidence they had been strung together into a necklace or bracelet, worn long enough to leave polish from repeated handling. Similar finds have emerged at other sites across southern Europe, recurring intermittently over roughly 80,000 years, and researchers have ruled out food preparation as an explanation, since talons hold no nutritional value at all. Why does jewelry belong in a documentary about family life? Because the capacity for symbolic thinking, letting an object stand for something beyond its practical use, is closely linked to the capacity for language itself. A community capable of agreeing, across generations and separate sites, that eagle talons carried shared symbolic weight worth the effort of working and wearing them, was very likely capable of the kind of communication this documentary has already argued was necessary to coordinate sustained caregiving and teach children specific crafts. This evidence remains contested in parts of the field. Broader claims about Neanderthal cave art specifically have drawn sharp pushback over dating uncertainty, but the eagle talon evidence has proven more durable under scrutiny, and most researchers now accept it as genuine symbolic behavior, independently developed before modern humans arrived. We are left, then, with a picture of Neanderthal families as groups who could very likely talk to each other in some meaningful sense, who could name a danger, describe an injury, teach a skill through some combination of word and gesture, and pass down, across generations, the accumulated knowledge of how to survive in one of the harshest environments our closest evolutionary relatives ever inhabited. That capacity for shared knowledge brings us to the final piece of this investigation's central puzzle. What happened to all of this? The caregiving, the family structure, the teaching, the communication. When Neanderthal populations began to disappear, roughly 40,000 years ago, and what their disappearance can and cannot tell us about the strength or fragility of the family life this documentary has spent so long reconstructing. Chapter 9. When family became a vulnerability. Everything this documentary has shown about Neanderthal family life, the closeness of small kin groups, the sustained care extended to the injured and disabled, the deliberate treatment of children in life and in death, carries within it a hidden cost, one that researchers now believe may have contributed directly to the extinction of the entire species. The very intimacy that made Neanderthal caregiving possible may also have been one of the forces that made Neanderthal populations so fragile. Return, for a moment, to El Cidrón. 13 individuals, spanning 3 maternal lineages, living and dying together in the same small stretch of cave. This was not an unusual arrangement for Neanderthals. It appears to reflect a broader, repeated pattern across the species. Genetic studies of Neanderthal remains from multiple sites consistently point towards small, somewhat isolated social groups, with limited contact between distant communities and a real tendency toward mating between already related individuals, simply because the available pool of unrelated partners spread thin across a difficult landscape, was often small. The skeletal evidence from El Cedrón itself reflects this directly. Researchers examining the site's full collection of more than 1,600 identified bone fragments found an unusually high number of minor congenital anomalies, small inherited skeletal variations, including malformed neck vertebrae found in more than one individual, consistent with a documented pattern of inbreeding. A separate genetic analysis of one individual from the site found unusually long stretches of the genome where both inherited copies of DNA were nearly identical, a direct genetic signature of close relative mating, more pronounced than similar signatures found in comparison samples from other Neanderthal populations, ancient modern humans, and even other primate species. This was not a flaw unique to the family at El Cedrón. It appears to have been a structural feature of Neanderthal life across much of their existence, and population geneticists have built increasingly detailed models to understand what that structural feature meant for the species as a whole. A research team led by Christ Vaesen at Eindhoven University of Technology built population models specifically designed to test whether demographic pressures alone, without any environmental catastrophe, without any violent conflict with incoming modern humans, could account for Neanderthal extinction. Their models incorporated three factors well understood in conservation biology as critical threats to any small population's long-term survival: inbreeding, which reduces genetic health and fertility across generations; what biologists call an alley effect, in which a population already small enough to have difficulty finding mates becomes caught in a self-reinforcing spiral of declining reproduction; and simple demographic randomness, the ordinary statistical noise of birth rates, death rates, and the ratio of males to females fluctuating unpredictably from year to year, which can tip an already fragile population toward collapse purely by chance. The results were striking. Running these models across a 10,000-year timescale, using population sizes ranging from as few as 50 individuals up to 5,000, the researchers found that demographic pressure alone, with no external threat required, was sufficient to drive extinction across a wide range of realistic population sizes. Reduced fertility linked to inbreeding, cited in the research at roughly 40% lower than comparable modern human reproductive fitness, compounded the danger. Even scenarios where inbreeding alone was not severe enough to cause collapse showed that combining it with an alley effect, modeled on the realistic pattern seen in some modern hunter-gatherer societies, where as few as 25% of women give birth in any given year, could still drive populations of up to 1,000 individuals to extinction within the same time frame. The researchers were careful, appropriately, to frame their conclusion cautiously rather than definitively. Their point was not that inbreeding and small population size were proven to be the sole cause of Neanderthal extinction, but rather that these purely demographic pressures alone were sufficient to explain it, even under the generous assumption that Neanderthals matched modern humans in every cognitive, social, and cultural capacity. In other words, Neanderthals did not necessarily need to be less intelligent, less socially sophisticated, or less capable than early modern humans to go extinct. Simply being spread thin, in small, semi-isolated family groups across a difficult landscape, may have been enough on its own. Other researchers have approached the same question from a different angle, and reached findings that complicate rather than contradict this picture. Some population models suggest that competition for resources with expanding modern human populations played a larger role than demographic weakness alone, as growing numbers of modern humans gradually restricted the territory and resources available to existing Neanderthal groups. Other researchers have focused on a different mechanism entirely, not violent replacement or resource competition, but a slow process of genetic absorption, in which repeated small-scale interbreeding between Neanderthal and modern human populations, sustained over 10 to 30,000 years, gradually diluted Neanderthal genetic ancestry into the much larger modern human population, until distinct Neanderthal lineages effectively disappeared, not through violent conflict, but through generations of intermarriage and genetic blending. A recent, still preliminary line of research adds a striking biological detail here, worth mentioning with caution about its early stage. In 2025, a team led by Patrick Eppenberger at the University of Zurich proposed that a gene called piezo-1, which affects how red blood cells carry oxygen, may have made pregnancies between Neanderthal mothers and modern human fathers unusually likely to fail, a mismatched version of the gene in mother and fetus potentially disrupting the oxygen exchange across the placenta. This offers a possible explanation for a genuinely puzzling pattern. Modern humans carry Neanderthal ancestry throughout their genomes, but none of it traces through the maternal line, meaning no Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA survives in any living population despite clear evidence of repeated interbreeding. The hypothesis remains an unreviewed preprint, not a settled conclusion, but if confirmed, it would mean even successful unions between Neanderthal women and modern human men may have faced a hidden biological barrier working against them. This interbreeding, more broadly, is not speculative. It is one of the most firmly established findings in modern paleogenetics. Nearly every person alive today whose ancestry traces substantially outside sub-Saharan Africa carries measurable Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1 and 2% of their total genome. The enduring genetic legacy of intimate contact and reproduction between Neanderthal and modern human populations, repeated across thousands of years of overlapping presence across Europe and Western Asia. In this sense, Neanderthal family lines did not simply vanish. They were woven, generation after generation, into the ancestry of the population that eventually replaced them. What emerges from this body of research is not a single, clean cause of extinction, but a convergence of related pressures, each connected in some way to the intimate structure of Neanderthal family life. This documentary has spent so long documenting. Small, tightly bonded kin groups made sustained caregiving for the injured and disabled possible. The same closeness that let a group keep Shanidar 1 alive for years, or support a severely disabled child at Cova Negra through 6 years of intensive need. But that same small scale, repeated across the species as a whole, appears to have left Neanderthal populations demographically fragile in a way that ordinary hunter-gatherer resilience could not fully overcome, especially once expanding modern human populations began competing for the same limited resources, and especially once ongoing interbreeding began drawing individual Neanderthals, generation after generation, into the genetic lineage of the population that would eventually be the only one left standing. There is something worth sitting with in this connection, and the protocol governing this documentary requires stating it honestly rather than smoothing it into easy comfort. The very quality that makes Neanderthal family life so recognizable to us today, its closeness, its intensity, the depth of commitment extended to even the most vulnerable members of a small, tightly bonded group, may have been inseparable from the vulnerability that eventually contributed to their disappearance. A larger, more loosely connected population might have been demographically more resilient, but it might also have looked less like a family and more like a diffuse network of strangers. Neanderthals, it appears, chose or were shaped by circumstance into the former. They kept their groups small, their bonds tight, their care intensely local. And in the end, that same intimacy that let them keep a blind, one-armed, deaf man alive into his 40s may have been part of what left them unable to sustain their numbers against the slow, steady pressure of a demographically larger, more widely connected species moving into the same landscape. This brings the investigation to its final chapter, and to the question this documentary set out to answer from its opening lines. Given everything the evidence actually shows, the caregiving, the burial practices, the shared labor, the likely capacity for speech, and the demographic fragility that may have hastened their end, what was Neanderthal family life really like, and what does the answer mean for how we understand ourselves? Chapter 10. What the bones were trying to tell us all along return, one last time, to the man in the Zagros Mountains. He is blind in one eye. His right arm hangs withered and largely useless at his side, broken so long ago that the bone has remodeled around its new, damaged shape. His right leg carries old fractures that would have made every step a small negotiation with pain. And in the final years of his life, the world around him has gone almost entirely silent. The bones inside his ears, thickened with growth, that stole away his hearing, one of the last senses standing between him and the predators that shared his mountains. For decades after his discovery, researchers debated what his broken body actually proved. Some worried the interpretation had been oversold, romanticized beyond what careful science could support. A fair concern, since bones cannot record love, and a scientist's job is to describe what evidence shows, not what a storyteller might wish it showed. But even the most cautious, skeptical readings of Shanidar 1's skeleton arrive at the same basic conclusion, because there is no way around it. A man with this combination of injuries, in this specific environment, at this specific technological level, does not survive into his 40s by accident. He survives because other people, day after day, year after year, decided he was worth feeding. We have followed that same basic pattern across an entire continent's worth of evidence in this documentary. At El Cedron, 13 relatives, grandmothers, mothers, children, men who had grown up together as brothers and cousins, women who had left their own birth families to build new lives among strangers, died together in a single collapsed cave passage, having spent their lives as a working, breathing, cooperating family unit, structured enough that scientists today can trace 3 separate maternal lineages through their bones. At Cova Negra, a little girl with a condition that would have left her disoriented, unsteady, and partially deaf lived to be 6 years old, an outcome her body's own evidence tells us she could never have achieved without years of sustained help from people who gained nothing measurable in return. At Pear, 2 small children endured winter after brutal winter, nursed for years by mothers whose milk left a permanent chemical signature inside their growing teeth, surviving despite the same cold, the same hardship, the same environmental lead exposure that any family living in that specific landscape would have faced together. At La Ferracie, at Roc de Marsal, at Des de Cubierta, grieving families dug pits, arranged animal remains, positioned small bodies with evident care, and buried their youngest dead more often and more elaborately than almost any other prehistoric population researchers have studied. None of this was accidental. None of it happened only once. It is a pattern repeated across tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles, from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the mountains of Iraq, appearing again and again in the one kind of evidence that cannot lie to us, the physical, measurable outcome recorded permanently in bone, tooth, and buried earth. And yet this documentary has also been honest about the limits of what that evidence proves, because the protocol governing careful historical work demands nothing less. We do not know whether Neanderthals experienced love the way we do, whether a mother at Pear felt the specific ache of worry that any parent today recognizes watching a sick child through a long winter night, We do not know the precise content of whatever conversations passed between the people who decided, over and over, to keep Shanidar one fed despite his inability to hunt. The hyoid bones and inner ear studies tell us Neanderthals very likely could speak in some meaningful sense, but they cannot replay for us a single word actually spoken. What survives is outcome, not intention. Result, not private feeling. A responsible investigation says so plainly, rather than filling that silence with comfortable invention. But outcome, examined honestly and at scale, tells its own story. Across every site this documentary has examined, the outcome is consistent. Injury did not automatically mean death. Disability did not automatically mean abandonment. Childhood did not automatically mean neglect. And death, when it came, was met not with indifference but with deliberate, repeated, sometimes elaborate ritual, applied specifically and disproportionately to the group's youngest members. This documentary has also refused to smooth away the harder parts of that same picture, because a full accounting requires including them. Most Neanderthals did not live to see anything resembling old age. The majority died before 40, and nearly a third of infants never survived their first year at all. The same small, intensely bonded family groups that made sustained caregiving possible also appear to have left the species demographically fragile, caught in patterns of inbreeding and small population size that population geneticists now believe may have been sufficient, on their own, to drive Neanderthals toward extinction, even without any direct conflict with the modern humans, who eventually replaced them across their entire range. Family closeness, in other words, may have been both a Neanderthal species' greatest strength and one of the quiet forces working against its long-term survival. Two facts that do not cancel each other out, but sit together, uncomfortably, as they often do in real human history. There is a modern echo worth naming here, carefully, without overreaching beyond what the evidence supports. Anyone who has sat with an aging parent through a long illness, anyone who has watched a family absorb the daily, unglamorous cost of caring for a child who will never be fully independent, anyone who has helped bury a grandmother, an infant, a sibling taken too soon, will recognize something familiar in what these bones describe. Not because Neanderthals were identical to us in every way. The evidence does not support that claim, and this documentary has not made it. But because the basic, structural problem every one of these Neanderthal families faced, how do we keep the vulnerable people we depend on alive, at real and ongoing cost to ourselves, in a world that offers no guarantees, is the same problem every human family, in every era since, has had to answer in its own way. We tend, understandably, to think of care for the sick, the disabled, and the very young as a modern achievement, something built through hospitals, medicine, and social institutions that did not exist until relatively recently in human history. The evidence gathered across this documentary suggests something more humbling. The instinct itself, the willingness to feed a person who can no longer earn their keep, to slow down for someone who cannot keep pace, to mark a child's death with more care than almost anything else a family does, did not begin with us. It was already old by the time modern humans arrived on the same landscape Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. We did not invent this. We inherited it, carried forward, whether through direct cultural continuity, through shared evolutionary origin, or through the simple fact that any species capable of protecting its vulnerable long enough to raise children to adulthood tends to arrive, again and again, independently, at some version of the same solution. Penny Spickins, reflecting on the broader pattern of caregiving evidence across the Neanderthal record, offered perhaps the simplest and most direct summary available, that these discoveries bring home just how similar Neanderthals were to us, particularly in a shared human desire to care for the vulnerable. It is a modest claim, carefully worded, and it is exactly the claim the evidence actually supports, no more and no less. So we return, one final time, to the man whose body should have failed him decades before it did. He cannot see the faces of the people feeding him each day, not fully, not with both eyes. He cannot hear their voices calling to him across the camp. His right arm, curled and useless at his side, cannot reach out to help carry his own share of the work his body once performed easily. And still, for years, someone brings him food. Someone makes room for him at the fire. Someone, faced with every practical reason to let a man this badly broken simply fall behind and be lost, chooses instead, day after day, to keep him. We will never know his name. We will never know the names of the people who kept him alive. But their decision, repeated so many times across so many years that it left a permanent, undeniable record in the bones of the man they saved, tells us something worth carrying forward from this investigation. Long before written history, long before any of the institutions we now credit with teaching us compassion, a family in the Zagros Mountains had already decided that some things are worth doing simply because someone you love needs them done. Conclusion. We began this investigation with a question that sounded almost too simple for a species this old, this misunderstood, this often reduced to a punchline. What was family life really like for Neanderthals? The honest answer, built patiently from bone, tooth, DNA, and buried earth, rather than from guesswork or old prejudice, turns out to be neither the brutish caricature that dominated the 20th century, nor a soft, uncomplicated fantasy of prehistoric harmony. It is something closer to the truth of family life in any era, difficult, costly, imperfect, and built on the quiet, repeated decision to keep the vulnerable people you depend on alive. The man in the Zagros Mountains lived for years after his body should have failed him, because people around him chose to feed a hunter who could no longer hunt. The family at El Cedron lived, worked, and eventually died together. 3 maternal lines woven into one working household, women who had left their own birth families to build new lives among people who became, over time, family in every sense that matters. The child at Cova Negra survived 6 years with a condition that should have made independent survival impossible, because a group of people who gained nothing measurable from the effort kept her fed and safe anyway. 2 children at Paya endured winter after brutal winter, nursed by mothers whose care left a permanent chemical record inside their own growing teeth. And across dozens of sites from France to Spain to the mountains of Iraq, grieving Neanderthal families dug graves for their smallest dead more often and with more evident care than almost any other population from that distant era of human history. This documentary has not claimed more than the evidence allows. We do not know if Neanderthals loved the way we use that word today. We do not know the specific words spoken between a mother and a sick child, if words were spoken at all in the way we mean them. What we know is outcome, measured, repeated, and consistent across an enormous span of time and geography. And outcome tells us that injury did not mean abandonment, that disability did not mean death, and that a child's passing was marked, again and again, with a level of care that speaks for itself, whatever private feeling lay behind it. We have also refused to soften the harder truths this evidence carries. Most Neanderthals died young. Their small, tightly bonded family groups, the very structure that made sustained caregiving possible, may also have been the structure that left the species demographically fragile enough to disappear entirely within a few thousand years of modern humans arriving on the same landscape. Care and vulnerability, in the Neanderthal story, were not opposites. They grew from the same root. What remains, after all the caution and all the careful qualification this investigation has required, is a simple, durable fact. written not in speculation but in bone. Somebody, again and again, across 300,000 years, decided that a broken body, a struggling child, or a life that could offer nothing measurable in return, was still worth the cost of keeping alive. That decision did not begin with us. We inherited it. And in a cave in the Zagros Mountains, in a collapsed passage in northern Spain, and in the frozen ground of the Rhone Valley, the people who made that decision left behind the only proof they could: bodies that lived, against every reasonable expectation, simply because someone else chose not to let them go.